and the scale of the additional models after the first import doesn't quite match up relative to that first import. And no matter what you're modeling in, this is an issue. So what we have for that is it's a very simple setting. It's the from previous import coordinate setting, but of course it's not completely intuitive to everyone. So I'm going to just go ahead and show you what that's all about. What I have here is an assembly. I work in SolidWorks, but these techniques are going to apply to everyone. And so what I have is just a simple assembly with a camera and two lenses. Now I'm going to be working with this camera for today's webinar, and I have two different lenses with two different types of lens hoods, and so this should be able to show, kind of working with variants of a model and making design decisions. So you can see I have both of my lenses positioned properly, and I've saved out multiple files of this SolidWorks assembly. I have the camera body alone, so basically this like this. And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is just import this. Camera body, drag and drop. Now the first import, you have the most basic import settings because you don't have any scale factor, as it's called, set. And so that's what we're going to be working with is this whole scale factor idea. So the first import, though, of anytime you open up KeyShot, it's very simple. You just have to choose whether or not you want to center it and snap it and which direction is up. SolidWorks is Y up, so I get to go ahead and just click OK. And there we go. So now there's a few things happening here. This we get often asked, is there a global scale in KeyShot, and how can I know if my scale or my model is the right scale? Well, the answer to is there a global scale is kind of yes and no. There is in the back end actual units happening, but we don't look at the units of your model in that way. We just look at your file and see in the file how many units of whatever unit you are using. So if it's inches and there's 5 inches, we see 5. If it's centimeters and there's 50 centimeters, we see 50. We don't see centimeters or inches or millimeters or anything. We just see the number. So what that means is it's going to take that number of units and either scale up your model or scale your model down so that it fits into sort of a box within the center of the scene. And this is one of the things that has made KeyShot so easy to use for people, is that you never have models shooting out into the distance, and you never have to worry about things just having to get set up. The model just pops into place and it's ready to go. But when you get more advanced, you start to have to worry about what about when I want multiple models. 1 second here. Okay. Sorry about that, a little technical difficulty. So when you start to work with multiple models, then you have to in some way worry about your scale. So this is our first import here, and I can display to you the scale that has been applied by just going to the scene tree here in the options menu, and I can see that this model is actually scaled up a lot in order to fit into the scene. And if I go to my environment tab here and enable my, not environment tab, where are we, ground grid, not an option often used. If I look at my ground grid here, and it might be a bit faint, let me turn my background off, turn this down. Okay, there we go. So we can take a look at our ground grid. You can see it's basically stretching across 6 of these squares. Now these squares are the closest thing to actual units that we have in KeyShot. You could think of these squares as inches or meters or whatever you want, but basically what KeyShot tries to do with any file that's imported, it wants it to fit into a 6x6 box or a 6x6 cube. And so that's what it's done to this model. The longest direction here has been squeezed down into 6, or it's been enlarged to 6. I have one person saying that there's an audio problem, but let me know if there's others experiencing that. Okay, but back to the point here. We have 6 units is what it's shooting for, so that it fits into a 25 unit environment. So if I look here in my environments tab, you can see here I have a size value and it's set to 25. So basically what's happening is it's taking whatever your model units are and either scaling it up or scaling it down to fit within that 25 unit environment. So now that we know what KeyShot's doing to the first model, we can think about what we need to do to ensure that the second models or any models after come into the right orientation and right scale. So looking at my scene tree here, again, we see the scale 43, 43, 43. Now, if I want to bring in one of those lenses, I have a separate assembly, and I've saved out the assembly with the camera body hidden so that I don't have to delete the camera or anything like that. But so what I have to do is just drag and drop, import. And you'll notice now I have different settings. I have the add to scene, I have retain materials, and I have the coordinates settings added to my import menu. Now what I want to do here is I want to add to scene. If I don't add to scene, it's going to wipe out the model I have currently in there, and it's going to give me a brand new fresh scene with my new model in it. So I'm going to add and retain materials. I'll cover this a bit later, but basically it just tries to automatically paint things up if you've already messed with that model and applied materials previously. And center geometry and snap to ground, pretty self-explanatory. And then coordinates is where you really need to pay attention. You have automatic and from previous. Automatic is basically what KeyShot does on your first import, where it doesn't even ask you. It just automatically applies scale to it, and that's what we're calling the coordinates here. So if I want my second model to be squeezed into that same 6x6 cube, then I want to use automatic. However, if I want the second model to use the same arbitrary scale value that was applied to my first model, then what I want is from previous import. Now, I've also positioned my lens so that it actually fits into the right area of the model. And so what I need to do to make sure it goes to that right spot is disable center geometry and snap to ground, because these will override the model's position in the assembly and actually force it to center into the scene and snap to ground. But now once I have that all set up, add the scene from previous import, click OK. And if I know what I'm talking about, then this should go right into the right place. There we go. Okay, so there's our lens, and of course now we look in our scene tree, and you'll see these scale values are exactly the same. Now one of the great things about version 2.2 is that we now actually see this in this way. Before, in 2.1 and previous versions, KeyShot was actually applying this scale. It might have applied 43 for the scale, but it wouldn't tell you that. It would say 1, 1, and 1 every time, no matter what. So what's great is I can import. Now let's just import the second lens here, and I can say automatic coordinates, and we'll just say leave it at that. Now the idea here is that I can then go in and say 43, 43, 43, and I can get basically the right result just by dialing in those same settings. But you'll also see now it's not quite as ideal as just using the from previous, because it doesn't actually place it in the right spot, so it loses its relative position. But if all you're looking to do is get the scale, then just match up the scale values, and everything will work just fine. So let's take a look at what we have here. Lens 2. Okay. So hopefully that gives you a much better idea of scale. And if you're still unclear, submit a question to the questions here in the meeting, and Brian is answering the questions, Brian Townsend, who often is doing the webinars. So you probably have heard his voice and seen some of his work before. But he's on the questions, and he's there to help. So if you're still unclear about anything that I cover, and especially if it's really unclear, I can go back over things if we see a big need in the questions. So let me know. But that's what I'm going to cover for scale. There's not much to it once you know what it's doing. You just have to understand that it's going to scale the first model some arbitrary amount. In this case, it was about 43 for the X, Y, and Z scale value. Other models, it might be less than 1. Other models, it might be 1,000. And that's all just because we're trying to make sure your model fits inside your environment and looks nice right away, so you don't have to worry about it. So now that you know that there's that arbitrary scale being applied, just enable from coordinates or the from previous coordinates option, and your scale will continue to work as you import additional models. So what I'm going to do is just basically start with a fresh KeyShot scene here. And let's see, camera body. So I'm going to actually start painting this up. So what I need to do is apply what I've already learned. So I want my first model to just go into the center and snap to ground. I'm basically using my first model to set the precedent for all the rest of the models. You don't need to really worry about what model you import first. You don't need to import the largest object first so that everything comes in smaller. However, let's say you have a model that you want to place into, let's say you have a boat model that you're going to place into a large disk that represents the sea, and you're going to use that disk to apply a material to look like water. That disk might be much, much larger than even the environment. So in that case, you might want to import the boat first rather than the water disk, if you will, so that the water disk doesn't get squeezed down into the scene, and then the boat is really, really tiny, if that makes sense. But there's no real preference for which model to import first. But in the boat scenario is kind of the only thing where that's a consideration that I've really dealt with. Okay, so we have our camera here, and what we're going to do is work on some materials. We're going to use some of KeyShot 2.2's functionality to help us. So I'm going to use the scene tree actually to make sure. You'll see with the SolidWorks import, we have the whole hierarchy here represented in the scene tree, and of course the outline that's new as well. So I can use the scene tree to apply materials to larger groups of things. So if I see that this is a group of this body here, I can then go to my materials library, find a material, and I don't have to drag and drop it onto the model itself. Of course I can. Let's go to metals. I can drag and drop it right here onto the surface. I can, before I let go of the mouse, I can get a preview. But I can also drag and drop onto the scene tree itself. So let me pick a better material. This one looks nice. So I could drop that there, or I could go down here and say, for the entire body 12, I can just apply that really quickly. So that gives me all of those surfaces with that material applied. And then I can go in and just either double click and fine tune certain materials. So let's say I wanted to make this darker. Or more rough. Or I want to change it over to a plastic or something like that. It's very easy to do. Just go at the adjustment there. And of course, also in the scene tree, I can link things together. So let's say I have this inner surface here. And one thing I'm going to do to speed up the performance over the meeting here especially is utilize performance mode. And those of you that don't know about performance mode, all it does is turns off all the nice quality settings. So if I press Alt-P you'll see things look a little bit different. What's basically happening is shadows are being turned off. Those of you familiar with ray bounces are being dialed down. As you can see here, basically the light, if there's not enough ray bounces, the light dies as it bounces between surfaces, and that's why we get the black there. If I turn performance mode back off, everything's illuminated. And this allows me to run at a much, much faster frame rate so that I can move around the scene and texture and do those kinds of operations quickly when I don't care about quality. But what's great is this isn't a different render. So you'll find, if I have a surface here that has, a very reflective surface, just bring that all the way down. Let's say I have a different environment, such as this factory here. When I go between performance mode and regular mode, there's no difference in the reflections. You'll find anytime a renderer utilizes sort of an OpenGL or DirectX based performance mode, the reflections slightly shift, and you get slight differences between the two because they are basically two separate renders. Well, in here, what we're doing is, since we have control of everything the renderer is doing, we can just turn things off. And that's what performance mode does for you. Okay, so I've applied some basic materials, and I made the inner area here black because I didn't actually model any details in there, so not a lot of point in me drawing attention to that. But what we're going to do is fine-tune some stuff. And we've covered this in other webinars, but it's very important, so I'm going to bring it up again. And that's going to be the gamma issue. And this environment that I'm in is actually a really good example of why gamma is so important. If I look at this at our default setting, everything looks okay, but it doesn't look real. It's got too much contrast. It looks like someone did some Photoshop work that didn't turn out very good. So what I can do is go over to my real-time tab, and instead of using the default 1.2, I'm going to dial this up to 2.2. Now when I look at my environment, everything looks a lot more realistic. Now, gamma seems like a sort of strange thing to have to worry about, but it's a really good thing to have in the tool. It allows us to fine-tune contrast right here in KeyShot, but we're doing it a little bit different than just a Photoshop contrast filter. We're actually adjusting the contrast of the light as it is interacting with basically the sensor of the camera in KeyShot. So what I'm looking through here, if you think about it as a digital camera, even though we're looking at a digital camera as well, this acts just like a real-life camera, where light hits a sensor and it interacts with that sensor in a certain way. And in real life, when light hits a digital camera sensor, it's looking at that light with basically a gamma of 1. So the light looks like this to the sensor. And then when a JPEG is output from your camera, that JPEG has a gamma of 2.2 applied to it. So now, why couldn't we just have an image that's already had that gamma applied to it before lighting our object? Well, you could, and it would look all right. So if we left this at 1, for example, and I set my image's gamma, the actual environment's gamma, to 2.2, what I'm doing now is basically telling the environment, the light, that it had a gamma of 2.2 originally. Well, that doesn't quite work because the model actually isn't in that lighting environment until it's rendered. And the light interacting with the model doesn't have the right gamma value. It's going to be different. And in order to get the light on the model itself looking like it was in the environment, I then need to still adjust this to 2.2. And now I have double gamma correction. So whether or not you kind of get the background of it, and you could do lots of reading on gamma, the point of it is just go ahead and set, when you open up a file, and we're going to make an adjustment to this in version 3, and we're going to default to 2.2, but when you open up when you start a project, just go over to the real-time tab, and before you start adjusting materials, set it to 2.2. And leave your environment gamma at 1. And then you'll be at the most accurate possible result. Now, if you want to use the real-time gamma to increase or decrease visual contrast a little bit, feel free to do so, but I suggest starting at 2.2 and going from there. It's a lot better to start at the realistic setting and then be able to fake it and adjust things than it is to start at an unrealistic value and then not know why and then have to try to figure that out. So go in there, set it to 2.2, and then go at the materials. All right, so what we're going to do here with this material, and I'm going to switch over to a studio environment. Do this one here. That looks decent, okay. So the first material I want to cover is this surface here. This should be sort of a thick, sort of rough leather. So the reason gamma, and this was one more thing I was going to cover on gamma, I'll just go ahead and cover it now. The reason gamma is set to 1.2 by default right now is because gamma has to work well with textures. So right now I don't have any textures in my scene, but if I did have a texture, we would run into a problem. So let's say I wanted to apply a graphic to this screen here. Well, I have a glass on the outside, so let me show all. Let's bring that glass back. Okay, I'm gonna make this outer surface a glass so that we can see through it. Okay, just a nice white glass. I'm gonna turn on, and this is another quick tip here. Anytime you're dealing with glass and there's stuff behind the glass, you gotta have detailed indirect illumination on. And you'll see then you actually can see through the glass a lot better. Okay, so I've hidden my glass. I'm going to double click on my surface here, and this is the surface I want to use to apply a screen graphic, or in this case I'm just going to go grab a picture out of the sample pictures here. I like the koala, so I'm going to use that. Okay, so I have my mapping here. The default from SolidWorks doesn't look very good, so I'm going to change it over to planar Z, click position, click in the center, turn off repeat. That's going to help me position it. Anytime I'm doing a screen graphic, I like to turn off repeat so that I can get the edges just where I want them. And I can use the position tool to nudge things around. And we'll just kind of frame it like that. Right click, show all parts, brings my glass back. There we are. Now also, for a screen graphic, right now I have my material. See my texture there? I have the material on that surface set to a diffuse. It's not really the best for a screen graphic. Instead, I can use an emissive or a flat. Either one would really work. And I don't need any color in the emissive material, so pretty much that right there is going to work. But now, this might not look bad, but if I pull up the actual picture here, it definitely doesn't look right comparing the two here. So basically what's happening is I'm inputting this image, and I'm inputting this image, and this image has already had a gamma of 2.2 applied to it. This was taken with a camera. The camera saw the light a certain way, and then said, okay, well, the human eye needs to see it with a gamma of 2.2. So I'm going to go ahead and correct that when I output the image. So that's what the image we get here looks like with a gamma of 2.2. When I put that image into KeyShot, and I set my gamma to 2.2, I now have double 2.2 correction. If I look at this image at a gamma of 1, the image will look correct, but the rest of the lighting on the model won't look correct, especially if I have diffused materials, like a, let me just turn off my textures here on the surface. Like if I have just a simple gray material here, looking at this, look at how bright the top surface is compared to the dark surfaces here. We're not getting a good light fall off. So we get at a gamma, right now we're at 1. At a gamma of 1, our textures look right, but the rest of our image looks bad. Gamma of 2.2, the lighting of our surfaces looks right. You know, it's a little brighter now, has a little bit more light to it, so I can dial that back down. But you will find, if you really compare to real life, the light fall off on a surface, especially a diffuse surface like this, only looks correct at about 2.2. And of course you can go to 1.8 or whatever, but to increase or decrease contrast, but 2.2 is the technical correct number. But so what do we do to make this graphic look correct while still having the right surfaces? Well, we go over to Photoshop, and we dial in a gamma correction again onto the image here. So I'm going to just quickly open up my KeyShot, open up any day now Photoshop if you want to open. Okay. There we go. All right. So the easy answer is just dial in a gamma correction on the image that is the inverse of the gamma correction you're using in KeyShot. So what I like to do is, instead of going, you can do this a couple of ways. I can go up to Image in Photoshop, and obviously any of the free editors do this as well. You just have to find the equivalent tool. I can go to Exposure, and I can dial in the inverse of 2.2, which is 0.4545. And that will make it look, well, that was on exposure, so I did that in the wrong area. Again, let me do that correctly. Exposure, instead of going to exposure, go to gamma correction, 0.4545, and click OK. So I can do it that way, but there is one little thing that I like to always do, and that's not be destructive with my editing. So I'm going to undo that, and instead of doing that through the image adjustment, I'm going to add a little exposure layer and say 0.4545. Now this allows me to go back into Photoshop, and if I end up using 1.8 gamma instead of 2.2 just because it gives me better contrast, then I might want to come back and dial in whatever the inverse of 1.8 is. And I can do that just by changing my filter now rather than having to start fresh with an image adjustment. So I'm going to save this out to a JPEG. I'm going to call this gamma corrected. Bump up the quality. And you will see now, let's see if I still have that loaded. Nope. Okay. One great tool, one great little tip here again. Right now, if I double click right here, I have a glass in my way, so I can't actually click the surface. Well, I can of course right click and hide the glass, but I can also just go over to the scene tree and find the surface. Especially if I gave it a proper name, I'd know exactly where it was, but I didn't do that, so I don't have that convenience. So in this case, I'm just going to hide the part, double click, that opens up my material, go over to texture. I'm going to now load in the gamma correct version. And now you see we have a nice looking gamma. One tiny little issue is that when you correct the gamma on a JPEG and you load it in as a JPEG, you'll see possibly, depending on the image, that you'll clip some details out in the dark areas and the light areas, and those details might still be lost when it gets re-corrected to 2.2. But it's not really too bad at all. So let's compare here. KeyShot. Just hide my menus. So it doesn't look bad. So in this case, if the nose is going a little bit too black, so I could go back to Photoshop and just nudge it off of 0.4545 just a little bit, so that I don't lose some details. So that's it's an art and a science. You just have to make those decisions. But that gives me my nice texture. Now, one really cool trick that I can use for this screen is I can actually take this emissive material here, and let's say I like exactly what I'm seeing right now, but I want to actually get light coming out of that screen. Well, I can dial up the emissive, but you can see I pretty quickly get some bad results. But you will see that, especially if I have my environment hidden and my background color a little darker, and I am glossing over some functions here, and so hopefully you're not getting lost, but a hotkey, for example, that I just used, E, to bring back the environment or hide the environment. And of course, all the hotkeys are found under the K for hotkey menu here. You just press K to bring this up, and you can get a nice list of hotkeys. On the surface here, you can see when I have my ground indirect illumination here in the real-time tab enabled, I actually get light casting onto my artificial surface that represents my ground. That's coming from the screen there. But my screen now doesn't look right because I had to bump up my emissive intensity so much. So the trick that I like to use is actually take this material here. I can copy the material. So copy. Now I could now add another surface in front of that material, even in front of that surface and between it and the glass, or I could just apply that same material to the glass. So now I have basically two surfaces with the exact same image right on top of each other. And what I'm going to do now is take my outer surface, bump up the intensity to get the light hitting the ground, like so, and then I'm going to hide to the eye. So disable visible to eye. Bring up the intensity, and a little nuance I forgot there. The artificial ground doesn't currently work with hidden from the eye emissive. So if I want to see this working properly, casting onto a ground or another model, then I would need an actual physical object. And there's a reason for that. It's that oftentimes you'll use invisible planes to create effects, and you don't necessarily want those visible planes casting their light onto the ground if you're looking for nice clean grounds. So let's just take this quick plane here, save plane. Here we are. Pop that into KeyShot. So in this case, I don't care about the scale of my new plane, so I can set my coordinates back to automatic, but I'm going to keep add to scene on. Okay, there's my plane. I'm just going to scale it down to really small on the Y so it has less thickness. I could have, of course, made a single surface, but I was lazy. Okay, so now I have this plane, and I can change its diffuse, so there we go. So now you can see, now that I have an actual physical object to catch that light, the outer surface is actually casting light, but not showing itself to the camera. So it creates this nice light effect here. So you can use a lower value to get a more subtle effect. So maybe 10. But we'll leave it at an exaggerated value. And there we go. And that will, of course, cast onto other models. It also, you can see, is casting onto the bezel. If I change this to a more, maybe like a black plastic. Another tip I like to give is when making black plastic, don't use perfectly black for the diffuse setting here, because that doesn't really happen in real life. So use maybe like 3 to 5 for really dark materials. And turn up my specular there. Specular, of course, adds sort of shininess to the surface, and you can see there now we have this nice glow coming from the surface. If I were to hide my emissive surface, you can look at how much less light we're actually getting out of that. And show all parts to bring that back, and you can see that nice light effect. Now, the thing we're missing now is that I had to sacrifice my glass material in order to do this trick. I could, of course, go back into my modeling software, add another surface to be glass, but I have a trick for this, so I don't have to do that. Double-click on my surface, go over to Labels, click Add, and what you need for this is just a simple image out of Photoshop or another image editing tool that has basically 10% transparency, or be 90% transparent. So what I have for that is, what I call it is my clear coat image right here. And so it's a TIFF, And if I open it, I can open that with Photoshop as well here. Okay, I have that open. So what you'll find is that this is actually has a very slight amount of color to it, and it's just a white image. And before I saved it out in Photoshop, so basically it looked like this before, but before I saved it out of Photoshop, I went to my opacity, dialed in 10, saved it out to a TIFF with transparency enabled, and now I can use it as a label that will show through to my underlying surfaces. So I'm going to go ahead and bring that in there. And immediately you can actually see where it is here, this little line. Labels don't always show up on the surface right when you first apply them. Sometimes I have to click position and click into where you want them. If I turn up my intensity, I might be able to see it a little more. It's a bit hard to see because it does only have 10% transparency. But basically what I want to do, the goal here is I'm going to cover my entire outer surface with this transparent label. And it's going to act as almost a clear coat. So I'm going to, instead of using normal projection, which basically just projects on whatever you click on, I'm going to just set it to box map. And I'm going to turn on repeats so that it covers my entire surface. And then now, what I need to do is make my label shiny, so it makes it look like a glass surface over my screen here. To make a label shiny, go to Specular here in the label menu, turn that all the way up to white. And then to make it really shiny, I can dial up my IOR. So you can see now reflections in the surface while still casting that hidden emissive material. So you can see I can still dial up my emissive and get more and more light. And I can use my label to actually get reflections in that surface. So I almost get my glass effect back. If I bring in one of my realistic environments here, you can really see the reflection. E brings back the background. You can see these reflections in the surface there. See if we can get some more details there. So you can see some of these reflections coming through. So you can use that as a trick for many different things. If you want to add a clear coat on top of any material, just do it with a label, possibly. It's a good trick. Okay, so let's just finish up applying some materials here. Obviously, there's lots of materials in the material library that I could start with, but what I want to do is work with some materials and do them custom. So one of the simplest material types in KeyShot is the metal. If I double-click and set my surface here to metal, it's a very simple material, but it can do a lot. It's not just sort of one-look metal like you get with some other renders. What you can do is use the glossy sample setting to really change things. So let me find just some nice highlights here. So of course, I'm sure everyone's fairly clear on what roughness does. It basically just, technically it's spreading the reflections around so that they look rougher. You know, that's the effect you get with a rough metal. But roughness isn't the only setting that affects the visual look of the reflections. In fact, you'll notice as I move around like this how noisy it is. Well, the reason for that is because the render is doing something that's what's called sampling. And at the very beginning, when it first starts rendering up, it's doing its first sample passes. And a sample is basically just asking each pixel of the image whether or not it looks correct, whether or not it's the right color. And when it first asks that question of it, it doesn't look the right color. It's noisy. Some are black, some are white, some are the right color, some are gray. But as you let it sit there, it keeps asking, and it keeps getting finer and looks better and better. But what I can do is use my glossy sample setting to tell KeyShot to ask fewer times. If I only set it to 1, the material will stay noisy. You can really see that here in these reflections. Look at it from a different angle here. Now, while I let that res up for a moment, you won't see glossy and glossy samples in the material properties anymore. What you'll actually see is something like this, just roughness. So in order to enable those settings, go to Preferences, Show Advanced Settings, and then they'll come up. So this is sort of the noisy version of roughness. But if I want to make kind of like the MacBook Pro roughness, which is a very soft metal, but you can't pick out reflections in it. And a question was just posted, you don't see the glossy again, that's in edit preferences. So what I can do to get that kind of MacBook Pro look is dial up my roughness to a pretty high value, something like 0.25 is gonna work. But if I leave my glossy samples at 1 or even their default of 9, it may look too noisy to look like what you're gonna get. So if I go in here and I set a really high sampling setting, you'll see that it actually starts to smooth out much more quickly and look more like a MacBook Pro kind of metal does. Let that sit for a second. And that starts to get a pretty nice effect. So something like 32 will give you that effect compared to 1 again here. If you look, you can see it stays. So if you're looking for almost like a rough cast metal, there you go. Now I'm going to set this to 24. I'm going to dial in just a little bit of warm color to it. And then I'm going to copy and paste it using my hotkeys over to these other surfaces. Put that one there. So one thing I like to do is just paste it onto a surface here and then double click. And for this I want it to be shinier. So I don't have to, I can use other materials in the scene to get a good starting point. Click on, do that here again, and this one I actually want to be perfectly shiny, or even just slightly less than perfect. There we go. All right, I'm going to put this material over here, so I'm using the Shift left click, Shift right clicks hotkeys here, and I already have a black plastic here, so I'm going to put that there, and I'm going to use this kind of mid roughness metal here and put that there on my hot shoe there. And I'm going to dial in a little bit of color. There we go. Black plastic's going to go there. And now I'm going to dial in some glass. Double click, solid glass. So of course solid glass will give you refraction. And the other kind of glass has the option to not refract. You can see when I look through here I get no distorted refractions at all. Now, glass can also do refraction by enabling two-sided, but it's not as accurate of a material as solid glass. So if I'm doing solid glass, that needs to refract, I like to use my solid glass material. The main area where it differs from the glass material in terms of accuracy is the way it deals with color. If I take my solid glass here and I dial in some color, you can see it has that tint, but it's not very much of that tint. And the reason for that is actually looking at, let's see, so the color here is being added into the glass, but it's not having a big effect. And that's because this surface, this really thin lens, is just that, it's very thin, which means it's not going to be bringing in a lot of color. If I reduce the transparency, it actually looks at it says there's more color per thickness than more colors for a given thickness than a higher setting here. So I can make it very transparent, which means it has very little color. Now, what you'll find with the color setting here is that as the surface gets thinner, you get a little less color, and that's where the glass material really differs. The color is the same across the surface, no matter how thin or thick the surface is. So, solid glass with a bit of thickness for color really helps make things look realistic. I'm going to copy and paste this over to my little lens for the flash here, and I'm actually going to not use a glass. I'm going to use let's use a advanced material to do almost like a cloudy plastic. Now, one thing I'm thinking for this webinar there's a lot more that I might want to do to make this project really complete. And I'm thinking that at this point, we might want to just pick this back up either next week or in 2 weeks and make this a two-parter. So, because I know we promised to cover all sorts of Photoshop stuff and some other things, so we might push that off, and I can cover more of these specifics right now. So, hope that is agreeable to all of you. But another thing that we get on our forum especially is, how do I do sort of a milky plastic almost? And that's kind of what I want right here. I want a diffuser. So what I need to use is my advanced material. And the advanced material is, it's obviously advanced and has a lot of options, but we can simplify them pretty easily. I'm going to set everything to black and just start with that so I can show what effects each thing has. The roughness here is the same as any roughness in the rest of the material settings. Index of refraction, or IOR, same as everything else. It kind of affects the reflectivity of the surface and also the refraction once it's transparent. But if we want to make a sort of milky plastic or a diffuser type material, what I need to do is first make the thing transparent, and that's going to be done with the specular transmission. If I dial up my specular transmission to white, we now basically have a glass. But what's great is I can say, well, the surface doesn't allow all light to be transmitted through. It's not 100% transmitting that light. I can say instead, do almost all the light. Do maybe 75% or so. And there we go. So we get a little less full light. Now, I want to obscure what I'm seeing through the surface a little bit. And that I can do with my roughness transmission. That's saying the light that's coming through the surface is actually going to look frosted. But the reflections on the outer portion of the surface will continue to look perfectly reflective until I adjust the roughness setting. So the roughness setting then will affect the outer surfaces, roughness. Now, it's not quite looking like any sort of plastic. It still looks more like a glass. And that's because what we need to do is add a bit of overall kind of whiteness to it. I'm going to do that with the diffuse transmission setting here. You can see as I increase the diffuse transmission, it starts to add that effect. The other thing is I need to turn up my specular. Just like any other material, specular allows the surface to reflect. So turn that up and we get some reflection. So now we're getting a pretty decent result. If I zoom out here and let it sit here for a sec to let the meeting catch up, you'll see that actually looks pretty good. Of course, I could then add a light source behind the surface to make it look like there's something really back there, but this is pretty good here. Now, if I want to make the surface really not show what's behind, I can turn up my roughness transmission even further, and that'll make it more and more like a diffuser material. Again, Glossy Samples has an effect here, so if I want it to smooth out and look less noisy, I can turn up my Glossy Samples. I just use like 16 or so. So that's looking pretty good. To make this image look a little better, I'm going to put in a studio environment. Let's try this one. There we go. That's a little more interesting. Rotate that around a bit. Okay. So that gives me a pretty nice looking kind of white diffuser for my flash. Now, the last thing I want to cover here is a nice texture for this. This is like a, this is, I'm sure some of you have recognized this as a Leica camera. It's definitely not any sort of production data. I just kind of copied it from pictures. I wish I had one in hand to copy from, but unfortunately I don't. But so on that camera, there's like this thick sort of leather grain grip. And so what I want to do is definitely use a bump map. What I'm going to do this with, though, is a plastic material. Plastic material gives me a lot of options for adjusting things like the reflectivity of the surface, the base color of the surface, roughness settings, and I can even use some of the same settings I see in advanced here, like diffuse transmission and such. So setting this is just some simple settings here, perfectly reflective right now. Looks pretty good. I might even use this as a nice material for my buttons before I continue on to make my leather sort of looking material. going to double click and I'm going to add a bump map. What I have is a bump map. Where did I have that? Let's look for leather. Here we go. So I scanned a leather-bound notebook to get a nice texture, and I have that right here. If I say preview, you can look at what that looks like. And what I did was, I'll show you the original image as well. Here's the original scan here. Okay, so you can see when you scan a texture, you get highlights and lowlights depending on the dimension of the surface, which is great. But the way KeyShot looks at bump detail is sort of if the color is 50% gray, you get 0 raise or 0 lowering of the surface visually. If it's white, it's the full amount, and if it's black in the texture image, then it's lowered, and if it's white, it's raised. So what I need to do with a texture like this is actually try to get the highlights, which are describing the edges of the details, and the lowlights into one image that has those details actually lowered, so basically black. So you'll see if I switch over to here, I've tried to create selections of those details and then made them darker than the middle gray of the rest of the image. So that means I've gone into Photoshop and I've color selected the highlights and the shadows, and then made a selection out of those, and then put them onto a new layer and filled that layer with a new color. So I'm going to use my bump here and load that onto my surface. So now I need to map. So easy enough. I just change over my mapping. My SolidWorks mapping isn't very good, so I'm going to change over to box map because it's a nice general way of mapping. And I'm going to turn down initially my bump height because the one thing you want to avoid is too much bump height. So I'm going to just turn it down so I can really concentrate on the size of it. So if I zoom in, I can see I do have those details, but they're not looking the right size. So I'm going to just raise up the scale values here until they look about right. And now I can try bringing up my bump height. So let's look at that. So, and remember right now I still actually have full reflectivity. I don't have any roughness on my material here. So we're just looking at, I like to set it to 0 roughness because I like to be able to see exactly how much bump I'm getting. Basically, the more roughness you have, the more subtle your bump will look. And so I like to start with the least subtle bump so that I can dial in roughness later to tone it back down. So that's actually looking pretty good. Might just scale that up to about 4, maybe 5. Get some real thick grain there. Try a little higher bump. So that's looking pretty cool. Rotate my environment a bit. Control left click. And there we go. My background is white, not white right now. It's kind of that gray that we said earlier. Just going to turn that up. That's looking cool. So now, one thing I can do, I could, of course, use, let's say I wanted to pull a little more detail into this and make it look just, it doesn't matter if it's realistic or not. I just want, a little bit more to it. So that means I can load in the color map, which is the direct scan, into the texture tab here. What I want to do is actually link those together. So if I go over to, I've already mapped my bump map. So in order, and I want my texture map to take on that same kind of mapping. So I need to click sync on the bump map, not sync on the texture, or else the bump map's mapping would get screwed up. So then I get my texture is now mapped the exact same. Of course, if I hide my, if I disable my bump map, you can really see the effect. Now, comparing, we can see in the background here my color image. This is not looking the same here because, again, that gamma. I have not corrected to 0.4545 this image. I don't actually need to do that, though. It's, for something like the screen graphic where I know exactly what it should look like, then that's fine. I really should correct the gamma. But for something like this, I can use the textures intensity tool or option to bring the darkness back that it's lacking. Something like that there. Now what I'm going to do, go over to the parameters and dial in a little bit of roughness. To soften that surface just a bit, maybe 0.05. And this surface, this metal, I might just make like 0.1. And you can see that difference in roughness really lets me get a little bit more interesting reflections happening. Put that over to these surfaces that are using that as well. Maybe just this one here. And I might make this a blue metal, kind of KeyShot-y. There we go. And so hopefully it's okay with everyone to maybe reconvene on this project later, and we'll of course send out a newsletter and let you know when that is. Probably next week, maybe the week after, depending on our schedules. But what we'll cover in the second part of this two-parter will be bringing in the lens and working with that. So basically working with extra models, and then also really finalizing this image, dealing with render settings, dealing with the different render options you have in terms of whether or not I use real time, and then also rendering out very simple passes. We're not going to get into, those of you that are familiar with more traditional rendering, we're not going to get into ambient occlusion passes and all that sort of crazy business, but a simple pass, a render pass that allows me to create selections of my model so I can do little tweaks in Photoshop, that kind of stuff we'll be covering. So watch out for our newsletter on that, and I hope to see you there either next week or the week after. We're going to stay online and answer some questions. We'll also, I'll make with this webinar, we'll post that clear coat image, that 10% tip, and we'll think of some other things to post. This model we can distribute, so we'll even put that up there. So, and of course, that'll all be on our forum. And of course, if we go to our forum, any of you that aren't on our forum, hopefully you'll get on there and post some of your images, and we'll be able to see what kind of work you're doing. There we go. Now, of course, we do post these right here to the webinars page, and this is also where you can see all the previous webinars, and we'll put up some of these assets there as well. Well, hopefully that was a useful webinar, and I know I dumped kind of a lot of tricks on you, and let's we'll try to compile some of these tricks into maybe some tip sheets. Also, I'm sure you noticed in the latest newsletter we're doing the quick tip, and this is, these kind of things will make it into there as well. Another thing I wanted to just draw attention to, we do have a brand new live image gallery. The internet here in the office is lackluster, but here we go. New gallery, looks a lot better than it used to. A lot higher res images also. You can see I can go into full screen here, and it'll go up to basically 2560 by 1600. And of course, if you want to get your image on the gallery here, either submit it to info@luxion.com or even just post it here in our gallery, our amazing shots thread, and we pull from here for our gallery all the time. So just send us the image, let us know what company you're with so we can credit you properly and all that stuff. But thanks again for coming. Hope to see you next week or the week after. And again, I hope this was helpful.